Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to everyone in Turkey, of course. And we also give a warm good morning to Witold, who joined us very, very early this morning. Hi. So as you see in the program, we will spend the first couple of minutes, maybe 3 or 5 minutes, for letting more people to join us. Hence, I will now mute and wait for more participants. Okay, I believe we could start. I see still people joining. However, we are already more than 30 participants who joined this online seminar. As you see in the slides, we have actually a short introduction, and then we will have Professor Pedrić to deliver his seminar, and we will have after an hour or so about 20 minutes for question answers and discussions, which will be moderated. So unless Witold you prefer questions during your talk, I just announced as such, but as you wish, we might have.
I think, thank you very much, Serkan. I think it's really up to the audience. I believe that if there are some question that arises during the talk, I'll be happy to take those questions, like, you know, rather than waiting until the kind of end of the presentation. So let's make it flexible, I suppose.
Okay, all right. Then we will continue like that. Whenever we have questions, please, I just ask for all participants, you may communicate through the chat box, and then I'm going to forward. So let me start by a short introduction. We are very grateful to host Professor Pedrić. He received his PhD and DSc, which is habilitation, maybe not common in many countries. We don't have it in Turkey, for example, but it's a higher level of scientific achievement after PhD. In 1980 and 84 respectively, both in Silesian Technical University of Poland. So he has held various faculty academic positions in different places. As assistant professor, he was still at the same university where he got his DSc from, Silesian Technical University in Poland, for about 5 years, during which he also had a postdoctoral fellowship position in the Netherlands between 81 and 82. Then he had the associate professor position in the Silesian Technical University from 85 to 90, during which he also joined as an associate professor the University of Manitoba of Canada in 1988 and 1990. And he got full professorship as of 1990, the first 8 years of which were in University of Manitoba in Canada, and then since 1998 until now, he is a professor at the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering of University of Alberta in Canada. Now, of course, along with this faculty career, he has been also taking roles in very important positions, which I list only some here, through which I'm not going to go one by one, but very important association presidencies and directorates, chairman of departments, especially the Canada Research Chair for Tier 1. And he is, of course, also an IEEE fellow. and he is member of various boards and committees, especially like APEM and APEGA, and also Canadian Engineering Accreditation Board. As I say, these are only some of the professional also involvements and academic involvements as holding executive or administrative positions together with his faculty responsibilities. And on top of that, he has received various distinguishments, awards, medals from different societies for his different contributions in the field, not only as a researcher, but also as a lecturer from different communities, as you see in this list, which is not also, I should just emphasize, a full list. Professor Pedrić mentored, supervised, led, in other words, inspired many young researchers in his field, together with many graduate students, postdocs, research fellows. I could not find an exact number, but it's really looked like very well about 100 people that he has so far touched. Now, his research interests and activities fall under the umbrella of Foundations of Computational Intelligence, CI, and also involve key information processing technologies, which are fuzzy sets, artificial intelligence, neurocomputations, genetic algorithms, and also evolutionary techniques, including genetic programming. Now, within the framework, the conceptual framework summarized above, he is involved in the specific methodological topics that are very well defined and highly coherent research streams, such as software engineering, system modeling and knowledge discovery, reconfigurable and evolvable architectures, pattern recognition. With more than thousands of high-quality scientific documents, Professor Pedrić is a pioneering scientist in his field whose contributions have a significant place in literature. And I can only summarize this by also even saying that he is shaping the literature in the field. So we are really privileged to have Witold together with us this afternoon, and for him a very early morning. Without further delay, I would like to leave the floor to Professor Pedrić to deliver the seminar. So the floor is yours, Witold.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Stop sharing so that you could start.
I'll start sharing the screen. Yeah, I think probably you can allow me to share the screen. I believe that. Oh yeah, okay.
You should be able to, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Now it's fine. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction, Serkant. I'm really just humbled by what you said.
Just reality.
Yeah, it's a kind of exaggerated reality though. But anyway, I'm very much pleased being here. I have been in touch with a number of researchers in Turkey. I think Tawfik was one of these kind of leading people. So when I got sort of more interaction with the university, I thought, yes, it's a very a great opportunity for me to talk about some research topics. So what I'd like to cover today is related to a couple of disciplines, namely machine learning, granular computing, and system modeling. So as a matter of fact, we can see that this is a kind of triad of these three main topics, which as we are sort of seeing today, they start to blend, they start to interact, they start to gain some synergistic interaction. So I think my intent today will be just to offer some sort of perspective at these directions. Obviously, the topic is quite broad, so I will try to give some highlights as well as get into some technicalities from time to time. But I think essentially I would like to talk about essential. So some ideas, some concepts that could maybe trigger more interest from the research community. Some of these research directions are well established, but some of them are going to probably bring some new interesting developments. So perhaps for those people who are doing research in a similar area, maybe this could offer some interesting and some inspiring thoughts. My email address is provided here, so I expect some discussion today, but if you have maybe some follow-up questions or comments, you can always contact me. There are a number of different sources that could be shared, so I'll be happy to engage in more detailed discussion. When it comes to the agenda today, I would like to start by sort of identifying some challenges in machine learning and sort of system modeling and human centricity of those activities. My talk is going to be self-contained, so I do not anticipate just some preliminary knowledge, and I'd like to cover some topics that could sort of provide some solid basis. So with regard to prerequisite, I would like to talk about one category of models that have been around. This category has been around for a long time, but it's time from sort of over the decades, it got revitalized and it really just started to assume quite a sort of solid position. I'm talking about rule-based architectures. Some of these ideas that were sort of developed in artificial intelligence. I would like to talk about granular computing, the information granules, but in a very kind of condensed way, just to get the kind of better sense what information granules are all about. And then I would like to talk about ideas that are quite predominantly visible today in machine learning, namely federated learning and knowledge distillation. And I think my intent will be to show that some of those sort of developments are in particular of particular interest when being augmented by concept of information granules. Well, so here's a kind of preamble that I would like to essentially, okay, I'm sort of at the same time, I'm checking the chat box. So if you have any question, you can put it in the chat box, but you also can sort of communicate verbally, okay? So here's the preamble. I'm saying I'd like to sort of demonstrate, I'm advocating that granular computing is one of these conceptual and algorithmic vehicles that deliver some sort of augmentation, some new functionality to advanced ideas of machine learning, namely federated learning, transfer learning, that is very much linked to knowledge distillation. Also, it's a question that essentially granular computing can offer us some assessment of the quality of this properties of human-centric models. And again, this cuts across many disciplines, in particular, sort of an area of where you have human factors quite visible, like management and software engineering. So I suppose it is needless to say that we are sort of witnessing sort of a tremendous impact coming from information technologies. And this allows us to really address complex problems, but also it comes with some challenges, because anytime we are seeing sort of models that are being developed, they start to reflect complexity of the phenomena, and essentially they call for some interpretability because of the fact that I suppose when we entered the recent decade of artificial intelligence, we appreciated the progress, but we also started to acknowledge that there are some challenges in terms of understanding what the models, what the constructs are all about, what are the implications in terms of their functionality and in the way how the results are being conveyed and in the quality of the results themselves. So essentially, this gives rise to a number of these challenges being implied by these key factors. So complexity of systems, well, it's an inherent feature. Diversity of data and their quality, distribution of data. Notice that we are really talking about data that are present everywhere, the data that offer some or allow us to derive some useful knowledge, but at the same time, we are seeing that data could be of different quality and data could be distributed. So in other words, the access to data could be limited because of the fact that they are the issues of privacy, the issue of security, and we are really seeing this type of a problem as we are getting more complex models. So we need data to fuel these models, to construct them, but at the same time, data are not easily available coming from a number of sources, okay? And subsequently, it's a very kind of evident need to interpret the results. So you have to ask the question, what is the essence of the result? How much this result is impacted by data? How much credibility do we have in the data themselves and in the results of the models? And how can we explain the outcomes produced by the models? Obviously, with the increasing complexity of the system, this becomes really a genuine challenge. So this is really a today landscape. And the question is, how are we going to address these burning issues? Well, I think if you go back to this entire domain of artificial intelligence and in particular data analytics and machine learning, we are seeing that this has resulted in a paradigm shift. And some of these developments, such as federated learning or knowledge distillation or knowledge transfer, are quite visible on the arena of today developments. So let's try to focus our discussion because I think we cannot answer very fundamental questions in sort of general term, but we have to also augment our discussion and augment our arguments by some specific sort of, categories of models. So this means that we have to focus on, in the discussion, on some types, some categories of sort of architectures. And as I've mentioned at the beginning, one of sort of very visible directions that is quite present in the area of AI and machine learning for a rather long period of time are just rule-based architectures. And we have to go back to the 70s. Well, it's almost history, 50 years ago. And when AI developed, I think there was a period in the 70s where there was a focal point was on knowledge representation, and rule-based models, or more specifically, if-then statements, were essentially one of these interesting developments in the sort of entire plethora of schemes of knowledge representations that were sort of studied at that time. I think it was a kind of period when it was a kind of acknowledged, well, it was strongly acknowledged that progress in AI can be associated with an efficient way of knowledge representation. So these rule-based architectures were about describing knowledge in terms of conditional statement. If, condition, then conclusion. Interestingly enough, these statements were formed at the level, at a certain level of abstraction. So I think what we can sort of use, using today terminology, we can state that those rule-based statements engage some information granules, and that is these granules are positioned in condition and conclusion parts. What is also interesting that rule-based architectures, when they were sort of established in the sort of 70s, they led to a large number of application-oriented developments that came under the banner of expert system, knowledge-based systems, and you can sort of refer to those quite classic medical systems, decision support systems. And there were just some key properties that were emphasized in terms of transparency of this knowledge representation scheme, explanation mechanism, so you can do backtracking and you can sort of, for given conclusion, you can arrive at conditions that led to this particular conclusion. And this, those were very important and useful features. Obviously, at the same time, it has been recognized that in order to fully benefit from this type of knowledge representation, we have to remember that there is a need to acquire knowledge. And that was also recognized that this knowledge acquisition bottleneck could form a certain sort of serious problem. So in other words, in the 70s, people realized that interpretability is just an inherent and highly desirable feature when it comes to system modeling, when it comes to reasoning processes. Now, let's move to this decade. The term artificial intelligence is probably just one of these headlines of ongoing research in many domains of information technology. And with the progress, with the sort of complexity of different existing architectures, topologies, such as those arising in the realm of deep learning, it has been recognized that interpretability and explainability become very central. That was kind of coined by DARPA in 2017 under the sort of banner of so-called explainable artificial intelligence. But if you go back to the 70s, you can find that these rule-based architectures can be regarded as quite useful and quite desirable architectures that realize these aspects of interpretability and explainability. As a matter of fact, that has been also quite fully acknowledged by the machine learning community. So you can probably find in the literature a lot of this discussion, deep learning, neural network, different classifiers like support vector machines, just rule-based models, K and N, in terms of their abilities to provide deep, precise accuracy, or sort of high accuracy, and some sort of interpretability. So if you look at the rule-based architectures, they can be sort of categorized into two main families, namely so-called relational rules that form the body of rule-based sort of models. And they are composed of conditional statements. If condition is AI, then conclusion is BI. Where here, the condition and conclusion part are represented in the form of formalized as information granules. In particular, there could be sets, could be fuzzy sets, and alike. Or you can think about functional rules that are probably more closer and more operational to the machine learning community, because these rules are in the format: if condition is AI, so this is again an information granular. However, the conclusion becomes a certain represented by a certain local function Fi, and typically those local functions are essentially linear functions. So as a matter of fact, you can regard this from the perspective of machine learning community as those being just some local models, because as a matter of fact, these functions Fi that could be thought as, for instance, discriminators or classifiers, they are invoked only within the bounds of the input space that is coherent or that is compatible with the constraints imposed by the information granular. So in other words, it's just a certain realization of this typical and commonly encountered idea of essentially modular description of reality. So we are talking about modular models, okay? Now, as I said about these functional rule-based models, that because they are in this format, one can sort of represent this, one can describe this sort of mapping realized from some n-dimensional space to the output space. Well, it could be the space of continuous variable, or in the space of labels in case of classifiers. So then these rules can be viewed as a linear combination of this local function weighted by the degrees that are coming from the activation of the individual rules. So in other words, if when AI is an information granular, this implies that for any input, you can get a degree of activation of this information granular. So that's what in rule-based architectures we are referring to as a degree of firing of the rule. And depending whether you are talking about sets as information granulars or fuzzy sets as information granulars, then we can talk about some sort of Boolean firing scheme that is sort of binary 0-1, or you can talk about some essentially partial firing or partial activation of the rules. And this topic has been just very well established. I think the rule-based models have been within the machine learning community and within the community of fuzzy sets and computational intelligence for a long time. But this implies that essentially we are talking about really a body of knowledge that has been acquired around this type of system modeling. So it's kind of modular system modeling. And this body of knowledge involves a number of analytical discussions with this kind of very cozy statement, cozy outcome, that those type of rule-based models are universal approximators. So we can go back to neural networks where this kind of holy grail of universal approximator has been just very much sort of emphasized within the community. And also there have been an entire body of knowledge concerning design processes of rule-based models. So these design processes were quite, were done they have some systematic underpinnings, and they have a number of design guidelines. I think given this, in a nutshell, the design of the rules the design process can be characterized as a two-phase or two-step design activities. Namely, you are concerned with the design of the condition part of the rules. So we are interested in building this condition part as the form of information granula. And then phase number 2 is just the development of the conclusion part. So the condition part was sort of revolved, its design was sort of based on taking the data and forming some meaningful chunks of knowledge, namely information granules. And this entire process was supported by a number of clustering methods. Well, if you talk about fuzzy rule-based models, fuzzy C-means was one of these kind of prominently visible techniques. When it comes to the conclusion part, we are talking about designing these local functions. And here, typically those local functions are regarded to be linear functions. So as a matter of fact, you can see that this is really a certain process where the model is formed through that sort of mechanism of multilinearization. And this implies that once you got a linear function, what is really left is the design of the parameters. So a sort of estimation process where you estimate sort of parameters of these local models. And this is done by simply sort of minimizing just a mean square error. And again, you had some analytical formulas that lead us to this solution. I think what is important that we have this conceptual basis, we have some interesting and desirable features, and we know how we can design this type of models. I've mentioned the term information granules, and I use this term just a little bit, I would say, without any kind of formal introduction. So I think it's probably for the sake of completeness of our discussion, we can get really into more details. Information granules are really well known because we use them every day. As a matter of fact, we do not memorize numbers. We do not carry out arithmetic operations on numbers, but our process of reasoning, our process of comprehension, organization, of knowledge about the world, and coping with complexities inherently involves information granules. So you do not look at individual items, but you are building a certain abstract view, abstract perspective of the real world. So from the point of view of data, you are essentially looking at some entities, some pieces of knowledge that result as a direct abstraction of data. So for instance, if you look at an image, digital image, you are obviously not identifying and working with individual pixels, but you are moving at the higher level. So then you can recognize some objects in digital image. So in other words, what you've done in a obviously quite straightforward manner, because that's really the way how we sort of reason, how we perceive the world, is that you bring some of these elements together, put them under a certain roof. That means that you put them, you label them, because these entities, they have something in common. So if you look at pixels, and obviously you can see that some pixels are positioned next to next to another, and also you can see that the pixels have some similarity in terms of level of brightness, in terms of content of colors, and so on. So you put them together. So here's really a sort of information granular. You move from this entire sort of, flood of data and get into some more tangible and semantically sound entities, okay? That could be called information granules. So while this process is probably quite legitimate, what is the current state of the rule-based systems? Okay, experts, are they making a comeback? Yes, if you look at this scheme that was provided by DARPA, I think in 2017, they tried to put a kind of roadmap, and they showed that essentially these rule-based models offer some interesting compromise between accuracy and between interpretability. Well, the term interpretability in this context was about say the number of rules that you use to describe the data. So the larger the number of rules, the more accurate the model is, but obviously you have more rules, so they are more difficult to interpret, to kind of get a complete picture of the word. Secondly, there have been a number of sort of usage of these rule-based models, because if you got this let's say kind of intermediate position that you have some reasonable trade-off between explainability and accuracy, that could be regarded as a good starting point. So yes, there is some comeback, there is some kind of discussions. Obviously, we have to admit very clearly that rule-based models in the 70s, they face different challenges that we are facing today, or what we are seeing today. And that's why I will be sort of linking this in the context of, say, federated learning. But there's also another very important problem. If you have a huge number of data, well, I would say high dimensionality of data, then it creates really a genuine quest how to develop these rule-based models. But well, I would say any other model. So there's a question, how are you going to accommodate some mechanism of dimensionality reduction, which is interpretable prior to the usage or to the construction of the model? Okay, so here we are. That's going back to information granules. So you have those pieces of knowledge that are convincing, that I offer some semantics. Well, I think this is just the way how we practically operate sort of in every environment. Let's say if somebody gives you a one page that is covered, that has a lot of numbers. Let's say those are the readings of the temperature. And somebody asks you, okay, could you describe this data by maybe in some abstract way? So you scan, you eyeball this data and you say, well, that was a pretty low temperature in the last month, okay? What have you done? You created an information granular that is just a manifestation, or there is a piece of knowledge that you developed, you extracted from this data. So you can think of this as a process of summarization. So at the end of the day, you just have this data, you create this piece of knowledge. So this piece of knowledge could be used in some follow-up processing, but this piece of knowledge could be communicated to somebody else. So for instance, somebody gives you a call saying, I sort of faxing you this page of numbers. What could you tell me? Okay, so this is just a very simple example. Obviously, while this may sound quite convincing, we have to admit that it is a little bit kind of qualitative. So in other words, it's still a question: how are you going to form an information granular? How are you going go from data to information granular in the certain well-organized, systematic, algorithmic process? And notice that what is done without any effort by us, it does not necessarily mean that it is done just the same way on the computer. We need, first of all, we need some formal frameworks to describe information granulars. Because while my kind of previous description was highly qualitative and maybe convincing, it did not give you any hint how I can formalize information granular. Well, information granulars can be formalized in many different ways. And I suppose if you just look in the centuries, how we coped with with certain level of abstraction, you can see that there have been a lot of formal approaches. Well, the easiest one, or probably the most natural, are just sets or intervals if you go into the space of real numbers. So you can ask yourself, why are we using sets? Well, because sets are just helpful to describe in a very kind of compact way some pieces of knowledge. Well, there is no point sort of enumerating 1, 3, 5, and so on when you can use a concept of odd numbers. Obviously, sets have a long history. You can have another sort of way of forming or sort of formalization of information granulars, such as probabilities. Well, why do we use probabilities? Because it's a very convenient language to describe information granulars. So rather than talking about millions of data points, I can point at probability density functions, at probabilities, okay? Now, you have fuzzy sets, 1965, you have rough sets, you have intuitionistic sets, you have hesitant sets, you have random sets, and so on. So this list goes on and on, okay? So they are just formal frameworks. So anytime you want to get into this sort of more operational setting, you have to consider a certain formal framework, okay? And at the end, granular computing can be regarded as a knowledge-based environment that is that revolves around the design, analysis, processing, and communicating information granulars. So this is a question, if you decided to go for fuzzy sets, the question is, where are these fuzzy sets coming from? And again, you have to think about a certain design process. And I think the kind of discipline of granular computing, on the one hand, is I think has a long history. On the other hand, is quite new because it tries to bring all this formalism together in terms of identifying some particular sort of advantages and particular sort of functionalities, particular principles that could be regarded as common across different frameworks. So I've mentioned this is just a process of abstraction, but you can see this everywhere. You have a time series, you have exactly the same situation as we discussed before. You have thousands of data points, time series, but at the end of the day, you can really interpret this by engaging information granules. So again, when we are talking about information granules, really we are sort of bringing a certain problem, formulation of the problem at the suitable level of abstraction. Well, I'm saying suitable level of abstraction because it depends on the problem you are solving, okay? So you have to either engage more details or really just leave them out as not being central to our investigation. So it's a really problem and essentially solution sort of dependent. So there are just some of these points that are probably worth stressing here. I've mentioned explainable artificial intelligence, and that's really where this aspect of information granularity can be regarded as one of these key contributors. And again, that's really where you are talking about this kind of white box and black box machine learning, and you can find that essentially there is a trade-off between interpretability and just accuracy, and this is really something that is one of this kind of driving force of our sort of investigation now. Now, information granules from the perspective of machine learning can be sort of described, can be analyzed as sort of some generative or discriminative models, okay? So in other words, when we talk about generative models, then information granules are aimed to the description of the data. So in other words, it's sort of representation of knowledge that is hidden in the data. So generative model is really just the same as you can think about, aspects of probabilistic machine learning that you are talking about some probability density function that are coming. Also, information granules can be regarded as discriminative models. So in other words, if I have a certain task, such as prediction or classification, I can talk about the sort of way of building classifiers, predictors, association models, and the like. So again, information granules are those parts, functional parts that are essentially confined, or they're essentially focused on sort of building the mapping from information granules in the, say, feature space to some outcomes in terms of labels of the classes. Now, as I think it becomes quite obvious nowadays that in machine learning, we are seeing a paradigm shift because of many reasons, because of the nature of data, and obviously because of the needs of the society, where you have to deploy the mechanism of machine learning. Federated learning is probably one of the kind of very visible and convincing directions that one can sort of point at in this context of new sort of challenging avenues of machine learning. Well, what is an idea of federated learning? Probably this concept has been very much publicized, not only in the research community but outside, well, particularly because of some flagship application, for instance, done by Amazon. So the underlying idea is the following, that we want to build a model in the presence of distributed and non-shared data. Well, they are referred sometimes as data islands. So in other words, we have really large amounts of data, but these data are not centralized so that we can use any sort of any well-known scheme of machine learning, but these data are distributed. it. And what makes the entire story more difficult is that this data cannot be accessed, which I think sounds a little bit strange, because if you want to build a model and you cannot get the data accessed, how far can you go? Okay. Are these situations quite visible today? Yes, because those sort of situations are implied by existing constraints. Well, you cannot share data because you have some constraints in terms of privacy and security. So I think the data holder, data owner, cannot share the data because the data are sensitive, because you have some privacy constraint that you admitted that you are subject to, and so on. Also, if the data were collected in a distributed way, it's very likely that they were collected through some handheld devices, which are not that great in terms of processing power, but also there is no guarantee that you can always have very reliable and of large kind of broad bandwidth communication links. So in other words, you collect the data, well, something like you have some sensors that collect the data, they measure some parameters of the environment, they collect data, but essentially the communication links are very much limited, and they could be a lot of distortion. So we see that there are really a number of these technical and non-technical issues. So if you want to sort of proceed with sort of machine learning, how can you do that? Well, the idea is, in a kind of, I would say in a nutshell, that essentially you can sort of communicate just not data, but you can communicate knowledge. Well, I use the term knowledge in general terms, in general sense. So the entire process can be portrayed as follows. Let's say that we want to build a model that is sort of beneficial to all the clients, to all data holders. And denote this model by MW, where W stands for the set of parameters. How this model looks like, it's not really that much critical. It could be, for instance, a regression tree, it could be a random forest, it could be a neural network, and so on. Well, these models could be quite complex, so essentially, you know, there's some memory requirements and sort of computing requirements to realize this model could be quite high. And the model resides at the level of a server. Now, let's say that the server starts with some very initial sort of nature of this model, okay? And what is being done and what is sort of, you know, essential to the entire sort of scheme of federated learning is that this server communicates with the clients who are the owners of the individual data. And the communication is realized in two ways. From the server, the parameters of the model are being sent to the clients. The client is going to essentially assess the performance of the model vis-a-vis its own data and sends some information or sends some pieces of some sort of knowledge signal to the model about the behavior of this model in the context of this locally available data. And the same is being done by all the clients. So the clients, each client receives that sort of the model, current model, looks at the behavior of the model in terms of the data and sort of conveys some knowledge about its findings. Please notice that this sort of communication scheme is just an ongoing iterative process. So the server gets initial position of the model, receives some knowledge from the clients about the behavior of the model, tries to modify the model. So there is a kind of ongoing sort of updates of the model, and essentially this process continues until, I suppose, it settles. So notice that the model that realized at the server level does not use the data explicitly, but uses some knowledge that is coming from the process of assessing this model with regard to the data. One has to acknowledge that because those are handheld devices, you may probably have thousands of those devices that communicate with the server. So from the perspective of technical investigation in the design of the model, you also have to remember about the way of organizing this communication in a sort of meaningful manner, meaning that you have to think about some communication protocol. But that's really just at the layer of communication. We'd like to concentrate on just a little bit more on this algorithmic aspects here, because, well, we have to decipher what this term knowledge stands for. You know, it's a kind of very blurry, I think, concept here. So, as I said, in federated learning, you have a huge number of applications, and that was really a driving force, because if you have the need, then you have to really spend time of working on this entire scheme. And I suppose those are really the most kind of visible, the most illustrative exam categories of applications. You can see that there is just a common denominator, that in each of these applications, there are situations where you have a lot of local data being collected. Well, you can think about smart transportation. Each vehicle is essentially is a source of data. So here's this sort of a general scheme, and let's try to decipher it, what we mean by knowledge. Well, one of the sort of schemes that have been promoted and have been studied in federated learning was a gradient descent learning. What is the idea here? Well, the idea is that essentially here, once you provide information about the model, then the model is assessed with respect to the data, and there is a certain loss function or performance index, Q, which sort of expresses how good the model is with respect to the data, and send some information about possible improvement of this model. And this could be provided in the form of the gradient of the objective function with regard to the parameters of this model. So you have Q1, Q2, and so on. Those are just the pieces of knowledge being sent to the server. So the server, when it gets all these gradients, it updates the parameters of the model. So this is just activities at the client level, and those are the activities at the server level. So you can see that there is an iterative process in which obviously you have some intensity implied by the learning factor. And as an iterative process, you can imagine that it has to proceed over a number of iterations. And so what is noticeable that I think in order to realize this sort of federated learning, we need something that is a kind of solid prerequisite here. What does it mean? Well, that means that even though you have different data, you have just data described in the same space of attributes. So they have the same features, or at least they have a non-empty intersection of the features that can be used here. So in other words, this is known horizontal mode of federated learning. It's also known that there is another one, vertical mode, where you have the same features, but you have a different data, okay? So this is a general scheme that we can sort of envision. This is the essence, okay, of federated learning. Now, as a general observation. Now, when you are really trying to move to some realization, you have to admit what type of model you are dealing with and how can you realize this federated learning in more details. So because we sort of focus our attention on horizontal learning, then we probably need to essentially look at a certain class of models. And again, I would like to make our discussion, the flow of our presentation consistent. So I'm saying, okay, let's try to think about a rule-based model that is going to be designed just in this federated mode, okay? So you do federated learning of rule-based model. So when we are talking about this horizontal federated learning, because we have the same attributes, you have different local data, then we have to ask ourselves how we're going to carry out this entire process. Because in rule-based model, you have to design just condition part of the rules, and you have to design conclusion parts of the rules, okay? So in other words, let's start with the condition part of the rules, and clustering, as I mentioned, is one of the kind of key technologies being applied here. So how does it work? Well, in clustering, you have a lot of methods, but there's a class of methods that deal with optimization of the objective function, and those are really just class where you are dealing with the development of prototypes and a partition matrix. So the point is that now we have to ask a question, how are we going to carry out clustering in federated learning, okay? So how are we going to learn prototypes and partition matrix? Just let's try to connect the dots. If you're talking about horizontal federated learning, notice that you have essentially the same features and you have different data. So what you can share just prototypes, and you can sort of learn partition matrix. Just to make our discussion more technical, let's look at the essence of a cluster. You have an objective function, so that's really what typical is for fuzzy C-means or for K-means, that you determine, you find the clusters by minimizing this objective function by sort of optimizing a partition matrix and the prototypes. I'd like to emphasize that prototypes are sort of defined in the same space of attributes. So this is really what you can sort of determine across all the clients, okay? So here we are. We are sort of considering the objective function that is at the level of each client. I'm using this index II to emphasize that this concerns the data and this concerns the objective function that is attached to client number II. So notice that here you have the data residing at this client, and you have the partition matrix that is particular for this essentially objective function, but the prototypes are really just common across all the data sites. So if this is our objective function and we go to the gradient descent clustering or gradient descent scheme of federated learning, in other words, what we are going to do is to iteratively optimize the position of the prototypes, okay? So notice that this is the scheme I showed you before. So this is a kind of a gradient-based update. And here is the gradient of this objective function. And here's just an additional kind of scaling factor that takes into account the size of the or the number of data at each data island, and alpha is the learning rate. So if you do this, proceed with sort of detailed calculation, then you have just a formula for the updates of the prototypes. But also, you have to deal with the updates of the local, this linear local models. And again, for this is a standard sum of squared error performance index, so that you can easily calculate the gradient with respect to the parameters you want to estimate. So notice that the communication here involves essentially the parameters of the process of the model, namely the prototypes and the values of the local functions. So this is being sent by the server. Client calculates the gradients as shown on the previous slide, that is calculates G and H, send it back to the server. The same happens with other clients, and this process is sort of carried out in an iterative way, okay? That might be a little bit modified version where you take into account a situation where you are just doing this federated learning both in a kind of combined way, the prototypes and the parameters of the linear model. So I think you bring all these parameters into a single vector and you carry out gradient-based optimization that involves all these parameters at the same time. So practically the kind of difference is that you are sort of sending this combined gradient of the prototypes and the parameters of the this linear function. Now, what is you may probably ask yourself, so where are these information granules coming, or what is the role of information granules? Well, the role of information granules is becomes apparent when we look at the sort of position of the prototypes vis-a-vis the nature, vis-a-vis the structure of the locally available data. Because notice that in addition to a particular data site, a data island, we obviously have other data islands that are sort of independent from yes. So we can, I can see, who can see your messages? Okay. Okay, yeah. I think I was sort of, yeah, I see that I know the time constraint, so I'd like to get to in a sort of systematic way to the end. Let's focus on this and we'll sort of decide how to proceed next. So the bottom line is that you provide the server provides the prototypes. These prototypes become confronted with the structure of the locally available data. So it could well be that some prototypes are going to land in the area that is quite densely populated by this particular data. But there will be some island, some prototype that could be positioned somewhere quite distant way from this existing structural content of the data. Well, it's nothing really surprising because of the fact that these prototypes are really coming as the kind of collective contributions made by individual data sets. So really we cannot guarantee that this particular sort of data are of the same nature. So what we can call in sort of statistics is this IID, a sort of distribution, distributed sort of random variables as in some other data site. So we can see that essentially from the perspective of the individual client, we can see also an extrapolation effect, namely the effect that sort of tells you, hey, there is some new piece of knowledge that you don't have at your side, but this piece of knowledge has been created, has been and conveyed to you by the sort of other data sites. So in this way, you can, having this situation, you can try to, having this data, this clouds of data, you can try to form information granules. There is some principle of justifiable granularity in granular computing showing how you can construct this granula out of the data. And then we can sort of, just looking at this information granules, we can sort of distinguish and you can highlight the extrapolation effect. So show to the individual client what has been discovered across the entire collection of these data sites. Now, there is also another point that has to be stated clearly, that essentially when you created the model here at the higher, at this global level, so this is what is done by the server, the question is, how good is this model, okay? Because that's not too much being said about the quality of this model. Well, it cannot be said explicitly because of the fact that you do not have data. So the server does not have data, so it cannot really just use the same way, the traditional way as machine learning, that you say, okay, I confront the data with my model, and I can say this is a least square error that quantifies the quality of this model. Well, this is not a situation here because you do not have data. Data are here. The data are never been provided to the server, but you only have this kind of knowledge hints that were sort of supplied here. So there is really nothing more than that you provided here. So in other words, one could think about the situation of sort of describing the quality of the model vis-a-vis the individual data, try to build a granular model just locally and describe its quality in terms of the mechanism of granular assessment, and provide this to the model at the higher, at this global level. So in other words, you can sort of think about a granular model that is just built at the level of the server, where the aspect of information granularity is regarded as the quantification of the quality of the model. I agree that's really just a little bit kind of quick quick display of the ideas, but that's really just what is being done here in terms of building a granular model to reflect the quality of the process of federated learning. I'm checking my time. I'm definitely very much behind the allocated time. So I think even though I have a topic of this knowledge distillation, which I believe is quite timely today, but I think that given the current circumstances, I would like to stop now and just get into the conclusions and view this as a kind of a completing point to complete my presentation. So as I said, I talk about granular computing and information granules, and I identified the way how essentially this could be supportive in terms of machine learning paradigms, in particular in the problem of federated learning. Obviously, there are a number of interesting and I would say highly promising research direction that still could be pursued within the bounds of today talk. So with this, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Many thanks, Witold. Indeed, please, we could have any questions, comments from the audience. You could just simply raise your hands.
Yeah,
You will unmute.
Oh yeah, I think Tawfiq just has some point. Tawfiq, please go ahead.
Yes, please go
Hello.
Ahead. Hi, Tawfiq.
Hello. Thank you, Vitold. The presenting is very nice. So I have a general question. So we talked about the learning, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and obviously we talked about some algorithms, and algorithms works with data and also the methods for data clustering and also models and finally about error and learning system. So what is what is the main differences from between the granular indeed machine learning or granular artificial intelligence and also fuzzy sets, or combination of fuzzy sets and probability distributive functions or density functions. So what is that general?
I think that's a very good point. I think I use the term granular computing and information granular because it's a kind of overarching term that is going to bring ideas, or that's going to embrace fuzzy sets, probabilities, rough sets, and so on. And I think my intention today was to really to give a certain kind of sense how this entire conceptually how this entire processing is carried out. But I agree with you. If you go to some specific realization or formalization of information granulars, then I suppose there will be some additional technical computing details that have to be sort of engaged in this entire process. So, yeah. What is the difference? Well, the difference is that when you get, for instance, to interval calculus, within the bounds of, let's say, federated learning, the overall architecture is going to be the same, but the calculations are going to be, have to be adjusted accordingly.
Yeah, exactly. Because if we have, indeed, we can claim that we have the combination of some data. So data interval, I mean, and probability and fuzzy. So in this case, the clustering of data would be in a different way, and there is some differences between the normal clustering and clustering of the. So this is the big difference. And also, I think in the final stage, I mean the learning and also the minimizing the error, because we generally we are against the optimization problems, and so generally the problem would be would have lots of differences in comparing the normal optimization problems. So this is a very good idea, and also the line of research to complete this research in mathematically and also the computer science. Yeah,
there are a lot of intriguing mathematical questions that can also try to associate or to link real world with the formulation or with the formalities of information granulars. Because say, if I have a granular model, the result is an information granular. If you have numeric data, how are you going to assess the quality of granular model with respect to numeric data? Standard least square error problem is not going to work because there are different sort of categories or different entities. Let's say, what is the distance between, let's say, information granular such as interval and numeric data? Okay, yeah, you have to define it properly so that we essentially can get a better or can get a suitable formulation of the optimization problem. Okay, and I didn't have time, but I think one has to look at the idea of essentially a concept of coverage and specificity that is provided by information granula. Well, that's in some sense, it has some interesting linkages what we see in statistics in terms of, let's say, confidence intervals and confidence levels, okay? Because they are just sort of, again, coming into discussion in such optimization problem. Not mentioned that mathematically there is still a number of unexplored areas in terms of information granules of higher type and higher order. I have not even touched this issue today. I was kind of discussing this everything at the level of information granules of type 1. That's why I didn't even mention it's type 1.
Thank you very much, Witold, and thank you,
Okay, I think I always enjoy your sort of comments. I think it's our enlightening, and I think it's thought-provoking. So it's always a good idea to have an interaction and discussion with you, and obviously with the entire community at the university. There was one message that was sent on the chat, accessing the slides. I suppose I provided the slides yesterday. I sent it to the organizer, to Professor Serkant. So maybe you may wish to distribute the slides if this is okay.
Sure. It will be, I think, very useful for all the audience who could not maybe.
Yeah, so probably the best way would be if those people interested can contact you. Obviously, if maybe there's some kind of interesting follow-up, then you can contact me directly and I could provide you some additional material.
Thank you.
Okay, there was another question, I suppose.
Yes, Wahid has a question. Wahid, please go ahead. You should, yes. Be able to.
Hello, Professor.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you very well.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I had a question regarding the federated learning. So you mentioned that it is a gradient-based algorithm. And I was wondering if there are any possibilities of being something like risky for the high-dimensional state spaces when sometimes the numerical calculations of the gradient are not possible.
Well, that probably may require a little bit a little bit more discussion, because say you are talking about gradient-based mechanisms if you have highly dimensional data. Is that right? Is that?
Yes, well, exactly. This is the case.
Yeah, it's a question how gradient of, well, it's a question of, yes, of the quality of the gradient, because here, yes, I agree that if you have your model that is essentially quite complicated. I was using rule-based models, so that was not really the problem that could have emerged. But if you have a highly dimensional problem and you have, you know, quite deep structure, then you have the same issues that are not even within the realm of federated learning, but within the realm of really gradient-based learning in terms of this kind of exploding gradient or vanishing gradient. But it's probably not that much you know, relevant, or it's not that much specific for federated learning, but for some the problem that is general enough, I suppose, sort of general nature. So I think yes, it's going to be, well, it's going to be federated learning is not going to solve you the problem unless you really are taking some steps, the same as where you are trying to avoid this problem in sort of standard gradient-based learning. I don't think that that's really just going to be that much difference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wahid, for your contribution. Any further questions from the audience? Seems not to be the case. Well, yes, Witold, thank you so much for your time. So we've had a wide spectrum of audience today listening to your seminar, not only from Istinye University, but also academics from other universities and also students. And I think we had some participants from the MLP Care Hospital group. I believe all you've mentioned kind of touches the field of many different disciplines, because this is something, as you say, maybe a very hot topic was the distillation that you could not get into of information. And these things apply to many fields in daily life, behind the daily life that affect the daily life, and much behind the daily life that instantaneously does not affect life, but actually touches how we can explore our understanding scientifically of the universe, which is even we poor physicists even try to do. And we are also relying on machine learning techniques to derive better information from the data we have currently. And this is how different aspects in applied sciences, engineering, and also basic sciences are working. So what you've given us as a general frame really, I think, matters for everybody on this planet, because this is where we are evolving in a way, decision-making and better or accurate result or decision-making systems. So I'm sure we will interact much more frequently for a more fruitful period of time. And we were very happy to host you today as Istinye University Institute of Applied and Basic Sciences, but also as the Faculty of Engineering and Basic Sciences. There were various students and colleagues who have come and contributed. I thank you again very much for your time this early hour in Canada. And I'm sure we are going to see and interact with each other furthermore. But before I stop, I see that Hatice Hoca is raised hand. Please, Hatice Hoca, go ahead.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Hi, Witold, how are you?
Very good, very good, very good. It was a
it was great.
Kind of pleasant discussion we had.
Yeah, thank you. It was very nice seminar and nice speech. Although it's not my area, so I had a nice time to listen to you. Thank you very much being with us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I also thank all participants who have shared their time and gave their thoughts and followed up with the content of this seminar. We hope we meet later with another topic, again, where we would host Witold. So with these words, I now close our session for today's seminar with grateful thanks to Witold once again. So,
okay, thank you very much. It was a pleasure meeting all of you virtually, and I hope there will be some opportunities to meet face to face.
I very much hope, and I believe, yes, we will.
Okay, thank you very much.